think it helps if I read, so I'll just read if you don't mind. Maybe there'll be a creative way to use the PowerPoint, but I can't both use the PowerPoint and read at the same time, so I'll just read. I begin with a personal fact which indicates that the tide is turning. I recently met a student, who shall remain nameless, who has done research supervised by Ramakant Agnihotri and is now working for a higher research degree under the guidance of Professor Minoti Panda of JNU. Ramakant Agnihotri and Minoti Panda hold very different views on multilingualism and the best way to tackle it. That a student today can meaningfully migrate from Ramakant to Minoti means that the distances between us have been narrowing. Those of us who are trying to formulate the main issues and face them have begun to converge. This is a moment of hope despite the obvious adversities today. As long as we allow the view of languages as codes, as entities that can be codified in grammars and dictionaries, the instruments of oppressive power will keep shaping our agenda and will propel us into foregone conclusions in keeping with the tastes of those who are in power. The more we accept discourse rather than code, the more we accept the functioning of speakers as an intricate traffic network of flows and connections, the closer we shall move to the spontaneous resistance with which the speakers of languages greet these maneuvers with which the oppressors try to keep them down. We need a linguistics of discourses which is aware of but not imprisoned by the old linguistics of codes. What is crucial about discourses is that they are shot through with the knowledges that travel with these flows of knowledge. Knowledge transmission occurs both through the family, as some commentators emphasize, and through schools, a point that has attracted the attention of others. Particular strands of inquiry find it convenient to focus either on the family or on the school. But pedagogy and the multiplicity of discourses need to engage not only with these channels but with a larger domain for which I am proposing a fresh articulation. This is basically the new point of today's talk. Combining some notions in sociolinguistics under the rubric linguistic landscapes with the widely used civil society concept called the public space, I would like to propose that the public landscape, a new term, the public landscape is where a community fashions its collective sense of dignity. It is often seen as a handicap that South Asian societies are anarchic, that we scramble instead of moving in orderly forms of traffic, that our jugaad defies conventions that other societies see as the basis for sustainable democracies, and so on. Let us focus on the fact that road signs and other public written notifications in South Asia are full of mistakes of spelling and wording in all the languages that we use. This fact manifests our very slow progress towards taking full, dignified and sovereign possession of our public landscape. We can regard the slowness as a handicap if we want, but we can also welcome this slowness as an opportunity to make sure that everybody is included. Those of us speaking the most widespread and resource-rich languages and those of us who speak the least numerous and least equipped languages can take active part in this universal march towards social dignity, seeking inspiration from the ideas of both a Gandhi and an Ambedkar, without allowing these symbolic points of departure to get frozen into permanent divisions in our collectivities. The main point of the initiatives we take has to be that we're trying to deepen and secure our democracy, extending the reach of democracy throughout the multiliterate skills that are mutating rapidly in ways for which I don't even the words, because I'm not 18 years old and don't know how to use all the apps on my phone. That is where much of the change is happening. With these coordinates in place, these were only preliminary remarks, we may now focus the paper on education in the conventional sense without losing sight of the map. In other words, I can now act my age again and not try to pretend that I'm 23 or 18. I'm saying 18 because the age was mentioned. I'm sorry about that paper. First section, formulating the problem. It has taken a great deal of effort to place the cultivation of India's multilingual wealth on the agenda of primary and secondary education at all. Many stakeholders are still not comfortable with this new addition to the agenda. One of our urgent tasks today is to re-articulate the agenda with the interests of the most vulnerable students in mind, especially those who speak tribal languages. In this context, it is fortunate that UNESCO and other global organizations have recognized the need to preserve tribal languages, especially those endangered, by securing their role in primary education, and the fact that such preservation must be built into the worldwide effort to eliminate illiteracy. In this connection, please note, many of you may not have heard this, that the United Nations has designated 2019 as the International Year of Tribal Languages. They don't use the term, they use the term languages of indigenous peoples. India has been taking part in the global literacy campaign. Since the largest single body of illiterate people live in India, this is seen as uniquely the responsibility of our country. The high numbers stretch our resources and turn Sarva Shiksha, education for all, into an abhiyan, a campaign, which is a telling military metaphor reminding us how bleak we have allowed the scenario to remain. Private sector profit makers are not interested in investing. Only the government and NGOs and religious organizations are making an effort to eliminate illiteracy. These stakeholders have accepted the premise that certain categories, such as girl children, are at greater risk, and that accordingly the system must be tweaked to accommodate those most vulnerable members. This emphasis implies that scheduled caste and scheduled tribe children get classified as needy and thus receive larger quantities of assistance. This unfortunately does not mean that those who are in power designate the medium of instruction as a topic about which fresh thinking is necessary. India has at the same time been trying to adjust its school system to the needs and rights of children as individuals. The efforts that go into this type of restructuring are very hard to combine with the large-scale mass campaign methods of education for all of the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Research has shown that if we wish to enforce the educational rights of individual children, then we must, as Rajesh was pointing out, provide primary schooling in their mother tongue. Any other arrangement causes cognitive harm to the children. This research, which has demonstrated this, is known to a very small number of stakeholders in South Asia. In our societies, most parents and most teachers are unaware of these research results. One consequence is that even children from rich families are often placed in environments which do them harm. Environments where they don't receive primary schooling in their mother tongue with multilingual arrangements which will kick in after a few years with due gradation to ensure adequate literacy in 2 or more languages. Neither the children nor most of their educators or parents are aware that this arrangement is doing irreparable damage to these children. And there are several additional factors that prevent us from doing this in the case of poor children, and certainly in the very special case of children who speak tribal languages. Let me mention 4 factors of this kind that make it difficult. Factor 1, the teachers available for what is often seen as the thankless job of teaching tribal languages don't know the languages. They usually come from outside. And they can't be given this knowledge on a platter because most of these languages don't have teaching and learning materials. There are no textbooks. Teachers who wish to learn the languages have to figure out how to do it on their own. Second factor, administrators in the government and NGOs often poo-poo tribal languages and think that schooling in tribal languages would be a crazy idea. Third factor, in some schools, the demographic pattern is problematic. Each tribal language is spoken by a very small number of children in the school. Even with great goodwill and resources in places where there are multiple tribal languages among the children of that school, you cannot provide optimal pedagogy and you have to find compromises. Factor 4, the parents of many children are convinced, even tribal parents, that tribal language medium education is a conspiracy hatched by the elite to keep the tribals underprivileged. These difficulties add up to the conclusion that tribal languages are a special case and need separate consideration. So in this talk I focus more on the widespread problems for first language medium education in the better established regional languages like Tamil, Marathi, Telugu, Kannada, Gujarati, Bangla, Odia. I hope that readers who deal with tribal language medium education will be able to make the adjustments necessary for their own context. I don't wish to underestimate the severity of your difficulties or the fact that there are no known solutions to those problems yet. However, what is said at the end of my paper will strike some of you as walking halfway to meet the specific challenges for the tribal context. In the first section, I try to articulate in a national context the linguistic problem faced by primary and secondary school educators. I would like to use the expression changing tigers midstream in order to describe what we have to do during this transition, the idea being that we are shifting from the old tiger, mainly English, to the new tiger, mother tongue. For the logic of the campaign of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, or education for all, coupled with the consequences of implementing RTE, the right to education, means that slowly but unstoppably we're moving out of an English-based educational system and beginning to face the challenges of taking India's regional languages seriously on their own terms and meeting the needs of individual children and respecting their rights. As we prepare to change from the English tiger to this new multilingual tiger, we must also take cognizance of the dangers of the old tiger, English, and develop strategies to address those dangers which don't all disappear when we switch to a new system, because every new system carries residues of the old system. We all know that regional language medium teaching systems keep a niche reserved for literacy in English and make continuous efforts to expand the niche. It's important to realize why English medium teaching systems need to make corresponding efforts in the other direction to make room for literacy in Indian languages. They must do this not to satisfy mass demands but to meet deeper needs of the children involved. The importance of these deeper needs is not yet widely understood by middle-class parents or ordinary educators, but a narrow circle of educational experts do understand how important these needs are. We must inform the public about these needs and think about how to satisfy them before it is too late to repair the damage our educational system has been inflicting on our poor children and rich children alike. This is what I've been calling my two-tiger articulation of the problem we face. In the following sections, I will look at various specific aspects of the matter, maybe skipping a few if time becomes a problem. I'm watching the clock. I'll end with a couple of theoretical and practical suggestions. Start with the question of Navodaya in 1986. Obviously, it's long been clear that education in India is in a horrible situation. Major efforts to address this situation began in 1986 with the National Policy on Education. That document affirmed that teachers had failed, that a special intervention must be sponsored by the state. This will rescue only some children from this horrible system of schooling, and the rest of the children will collapse, which is fine because there's nothing to be done about them. For this purpose, the document suggested setting up some new schools called Navodaya schools. The 1986 document held out no hope for all children. It implied that the nation couldn't afford to even try to save all children. In a perspective shaped by UNESCO's Millennium Development Goals, now that India has committed itself to the complete eradication of illiteracy, does it now make sense to simply upscale the Navodaya solution so that we can deliver the currently promised education for all? Alas, we cannot even imagine such an upscaling. Some of you must have looked at the budget numbers and you know that we're not going to invest in school education. We've decided not to. There never was a Navodaya solution in practice or even in theory, other than equipping its teachers with the standard normative competence that government funding can buy. The Navodaya schools have not distinguished themselves by creating a new path. The 1986 policy was already quite bad. It shouldn't be necessary to say all this. All commentators should have realized long ago and should have told the government and the public that 1986 was a disaster. It left the mimicry syndrome unaddressed. But unfortunately, those in charge standardly assume that even though rote learning, mimicry, clerical reproduction, and other names for this feature of our faulty study methods have been acknowledged as a bane of most Indian school children, these features are just a side issue. Standard commentators have been tirelessly saying that the mimicry syndrome will vanish once we eliminate private coaching. Once we train the school teachers according to the perfect syllabi of B.Ed and M.Ed courses, once we give the schools enough money to consolidate their buildings and secure the pay packages of administrators and teachers. Notice that I'm saying administrators first because they lobby much better. Once we achieve the other perfections repeated in every election manifesto of every political party in this country, while the pundits are aware that obvious factors persistently keep these goals out of our reach, they nonetheless assume that the mimicry syndrome is not a separate nut to crack. It will automatically dissolve as we make progress on these other fronts. Alas, those commentators are grotesquely wrong. The mimicry syndrome manifests mechanical hierarchy, the core malady afflicting our culture, including the caste system. We in India are orthodox. We want babies to grow into children who mimic and children to grow into adults who mimic, for only mimicry guarantees mechanical obedience to hierarchically transmitted instructions. In short, we are afraid of personal independence. This is our core malady. No approach to education can succeed if it fails to address this uniquely Indian pathology. I'm embarrassed as a professional linguist to observe that linguistics does have a uniquely effective set of tools and can help address our core malady, but that in practice our linguists have allowed themselves to be stampeded into accepting the current state of affairs. So I dare not invoke linguistics at this point in the talk. I shall return to its virtues and vices a bit later. At this point, it's perhaps most useful if we categorize the major defects of the 1986 policy in terms of three types of deficit. Educational, psycholinguistic, sociolinguistic. Educational deficit. A serious education stimulates students, enabling them to blossom as children and to flourish as adults. The 1986 policy simply missed the point. It was not an informed educational policy at all. Psycholinguistic deficit. Psycholinguistic research has shown that for the languages in which a child needs to operate seriously, schooling will have to equip her with competence of two types. First, basic interactive proficiency, then building on that foundation, cognitive academic language proficiency, CALP, in the context of the intellectual content of secondary schooling. These concepts were fashioned by Jim Cummins. Given this research, we must evaluate each education system in terms of whether it imparts cognitive academic language proficiency in the child's first language and in the language or languages of wider communication like Hindi, English, regional language, etc. The 1986 policy document evinced no awareness of these issues and was in any case finalized at a time when these results, although they already existed, were not widely known. 86 is the year when Tovis Kutnapkangas comes to the World Sociology Congress in Delhi and tells a wider group of people in South Asia about these results. I, for one, had not heard of them. I met Tove in 1986 in Delhi, thanks to Lachman Khubchandani, who is no more. Sociolinguistic deficit of the 1986 policy. India as a polity, as a political system, rests on an innovative linguistic deal built as it is around the notion of linguistic states that constitutionally guarantee the rights of minority languages. Any serious educational system that intends to follow the rules must do what is required not just to implement constitutional provisions but to educate each child about the linguistic rights and responsibilities of all children on the way to an adult understanding of what is involved in being a citizen of a uniquely multilingual republic. For adults to fully participate in the public space, education needs to prepare them when they are young, connecting them with the terms of the public discourse. The Indian educational system has never been seen in these terms. Certainly the 1986 document did not try to do so. Why am I spending so much time on 1986, writing so many years later? Is it not more appropriate for us today to comment on at least the National Curricular Framework 2005's remarks on language and education itself, or even on the incipient educational policy document that the current government has been publicly incubating for a couple of years now? There's a draft up on the web that you can look up if you want. They haven't finalized it yet. They're still taking input from the public. Deepening democracy, next section. I would have liked to see the National Curricular Framework 2005 put together with respect to language by our friend Ramakant Agnihotri move away from the 1986 document towards democracy. This did not happen. Ramakant is a good man and a sincere man, but he was in that chair where all the lobbies were putting pressure on him, and he couldn't resist the pressure. He knew that if he tried to write a sincere document, the government would not adopt it. He had to do what was possible. Hence my decision to focus on what it takes for an educational policy to direct itself towards deepening democracy. Please forgive me for not commenting on the current government's document incubation enterprise here. That is a separate battle. I'll be happy to tell you about it. It's a long story and a sad story. Ours is a culture of hierarchical instruction. Even democratic intellectuals write mainly in English or only in English, hoping that it will all trickle down, which is a hierarchical hope. This style of theirs is more than bad pedagogy, it is a case of democratic intent subverting itself. This subversion needs to be condemned in unequivocal terms. I have found that people don't understand subtle prose. Let me therefore speak candidly. India's elite since 1947 has kept trying to win approval from old masters in Britain and new masters in the United States. Even when we were following a political and economic path that opposed Anglo-America's geopolitics, because we were friends with the Russians, our elite did not make the slightest attempt to set itself credible goals on a basis truly independent of Anglo-American perceptions. All efforts, including efforts on the left that pretended to be oppositional, took Anglophone norms for granted. Our radicals kept emulating, kept copying English and American radicals. Even intellectuals working in Indian languages have stayed in an exclusively asymmetric translational relation with English as the unique reference discourse. In other words, we translate only from English. Knowledge texts are translated from English into Indian languages. It is assumed that there are no knowledge texts in Indian languages that need to be translated into English and thrust under the nose of the members of the white Herrenvolk out there in the West. Herrenvolk being the German term used by Hitler and others for the master race. Herren means masters, Volk means race. It's a Nazi term. The whites to this day are basically in the Nazi mentality. There are various degrees of this. There are softcore Nazis and hardcore Nazis, which is why you will find the softcore Nazis telling you that these hardcore bad guys are the real Nazis. We are not Nazis, we are nice people. Many of my white friends are softcore Nazis, and I've had to deal with this all my life. But I like to be frank. Despite the long demonstrated gross incompetence of some white people who say they are linguists in the domain of learning the languages of the global south, I defy you to show me one linguistics paper written by a white man or woman and published in a language of the south, in Arabic, in Turkish, in Bangla, in Hindi. I defy you to show me one instance. I defy you to bring me a white man or woman who is capable of writing such a paper. How dare they call themselves linguists? Shame on them. Shame on those of us who are licking their boots. Shame on you if you're licking their boots. Don't smile, you're probably part of the problem. This is galm. This is not a joke. To defend this as a rational strategy on the basis of claims about the global reach of English would be to miss the point. The point is that India's English-focused intelligentsia have chosen to avoid reading each other's work. We read white people, we don't read each other. To marginalize the enterprises of Tagore, Gandhi, Aurobindo, Krishnamurti, a whole bunch of people. To push Indian language-focused inquiry into provincial ghettos. To miniaturize our historical memory down to a 20-year time span. I think most of you in this room don't really know about the emergency, for example. It's not the fault of those who are young. It's the fault of the older people who haven't been telling you what it's about. That's one example. To belittle access to other global communication channels like French, German, Russian, Spanish, Arabic or Chinese. To keep these grotesque choices out of sight by pushing screaming headlines into the forefront of everybody's attention. Very few intellectual classes in modern times with such access to resources have let their public down on such a spectacular scale. This is the equivalent of a bunch of soldiers at the border losing all the battles. That is what our intelligentsia has been like. It's been a shameful intelligentsia. Our badly designed education system and our half-hearted efforts to tweak it, we keep talking about not having enough money for elementary education, are only some of the effects of the pathological choices that our elite has made for itself and has successfully imposed on the rest of our social order. One place that can in principle help us to identify these pathologies and come up with an antidote or two is in fact linguistics. This discipline has the resources to constrain the power of the authoritarian imagination embodied as grammar. Now the global hierarchy associated with the grammatical embodiment of the authoritarian imagination can be said to treat ELT, English language teaching, as one of its central enterprises. Given the terms of reference of linguistics as a discipline, whose supposedly scientific claims should delink it from the authoritarian imagination, one would have expected that the best linguists writing today would be engaged in a critical counter-enterprise, or at least that they would keep ELT at arm's length. To our dismay, we find instead that linguists are in bed with ELT. Those of us who want to improve the cultural and educational scene can respond to this predicament by taking it on ourselves to help establish an authentic linguistics, a linguistics that articulates and addresses the needs of serious pedagogy in a contestatory marginal location. I will soon emphasize reasons why I'm visualizing this location on the edge of the poisonous systems currently prevalent, not a position of exile. The enemy wants us to go into exile so that they can ignore us. The point is to stay on the margin and make sure that the enemy has to deal with our firepower. In the early 20th century, linguists were steeped in a spirit of modern democratic reform of cultural institutions under a worldwide colonial regime. That impulse has long been abandoned and was in any case associated with the old linguistics of codes, linguistics of languages seen in terms of codifiable grammars and dictionaries, even if scientific linguists did not agree with the way in which authoritarian codifiers had been earlier doing their codifying, which was called prescriptive. In our more accountable times, which are sensitive to human rights and to the desire of those that social sciences work on to speak for themselves as much as possible, far from what Foucault has called the indignity of speaking for others, well, we are now carrying out a transition from that hierarchical linguistics of codes to a democratic linguistics of discourses. This task has two dimensions to it, a social dimension and an academic dimension. On the socio-political axis, the task we have is to challenge the forces that have kept the authoritarian imagination in power. India is not the only country where it's in power. It is grotesquely in power in India. It's in power everywhere. On the intellectual plane, scholars who are carrying out the unfinished academic struggle against the residues of colonialism have diagnosed our pathology, including the mimicry syndrome, in terms of a particular kind of colonization. Those scholars, such as Jürgen Habermas, have called it the colonization of the life world by the systems. I'm mentioning these technical terms just to help some of you to identify the type of analysis in mind. I can't assume that everybody in the room uses Habermas. If you don't use Habermas, use other resources, whatever you find relevant. The linguistics of discourses doesn't, of course, simply jettison the older work done in the linguistics of codes. You can't jettison older work and continue to be accountable. You have to inherit older work and inherit it differently. The point is to turn the codifiers into servants rather than masters, reversing the arrow of colonization, and to put in place the constituent assembly of authentic popular articulators who have to learn how to make these servants serve their true masters, namely the public. It's not easy to do it. It's easy to say this, but it's not easy to do it. The task so visualized needs to be translated into a concrete program so that workers of different sorts can contribute to the common cause without getting in each other's way. From this point onwards, I shall make brief and focused points about such a program of action in a series of particular capsule-like points. The first such point is long-term goal perspectivism. David Blythe's 1988 book with a vision called The Double Perspective may inform the way we should update the pedagogic mix, the pedagogic cooking style that we inherit from Gandhi, Tagore, Aurobindo, Krishnamurti and others, perhaps with bits of Paulo Freire or Ivan Illich thrown in as tokens of the need for South-South dialogue on our way to a democratic linguistics of discourses that will work in partnership with educational activists at a global level. David Blythe, in that book of his called The Double Perspective, proposed that for every binary, men versus women, blacks versus whites, city versus countryside, in our context, Savarna Hindus versus Dalits, and so on, the task of education is to teach children from each side of the divide to take the point of view of the other side on board. He devised special educational techniques that show college students how to do this. Very quickly, yes, I do have the time. Blythe was a college teacher of English literature. He would prescribe, let us say, 10 books, 10 novels. And he would ask the 20 students in his class to write 20 term papers about these novels. He himself would write a term paper. That was task number 1. Task number 2 was there would be Xeroxes of everybody's term papers, and each person would get the other 20 term papers, the other 19 students and the teacher's term paper, Xeroxed, and would have to write a second term paper about all these term papers. Now, what then emerged was men and women read differently, blacks and whites read differently, Hispanics and non-Hispanics read differently, etc., etc. You study the readings. You study the modes of reading. You do that for your entire college course in English literature. That was like formula. Our long-term goal is to build techniques of that kind into schooling. Obviously, you can't do it at that level. These are college students. You have to do it very differently for younger children. But the point is to bring in the double perspective. I mention David Blythe, because he has created a theory-praxis interface in his work and explicitly begins to fashion a democratic linguistics of discourses in his book. It's a very important book. My second capsule, a series of short-term targets on the way to that long-term goal of perspectivism. We need to set interim targets because we obviously can't achieve that kind of target at once. The long-term goal presupposes robust adult dissent, led by articulate Bahujans, Girijans, women, LGBTs, persons with disability, and others. And since others is a confusing phrase, let's say other marginals, this is a conference on margins. I propose to call this kind of dissent Ceteropolitics. Cetero is the second word of etc., others. The Hindi term I propose for this, Avashishtavad, as opposed to Vishishta. Okay. Avashishta, the rest, the others. To organize Cetero dissent is an essential step in the transition from the politics of codes to a politics of discourses. The politics of codes has become articulated in identity politics, whose leaders concede the cushy territory to hegemons and are content to grab ghettos of their own, which they get to codify. Cetero dissenters, unlike identity politics leaders, openly contest hegemony itself, not just the hegemons. They stay in margins in order to do so without developing vested interests. Note that margins are not positions of exile. To exile oneself is to step out of the code and thus to indirectly acknowledge the code as a legitimation device. Next capsule, why short-term targets like this? Why set up a series of short-term targets? Children for whom education must be designed cannot wait for the perfect answer. Suppose the perfect answer takes you 15 years to incubate. What do the children do for these 15 years? They're growing up. They have to get something now. For the good of the children, education has to be upscaled right now, under conditions acknowledged to be oppressive, with teachers acknowledged to be ill-trained, who are in distress without relief. I was at a gathering in Mysore 5 years ago or thereabouts, and some very well-meaning people were discussing how to make sure that multilingual education following the theories of Jim Cummins and Tovis Kutnapangas can be delivered to tribal children in many villages of India. And the discussion at one point came to the salaries of the teachers, and there was a debate about whether the government can afford to raise the salaries. Do you know what numbers were being discussed? There was a hall full of grown men and women seriously discussing, nobody laughed, whether it's possible to raise the salary from 2,300 rupees a month to 2,500 rupees a month. We're expecting teachers paid at most 2,500 rupees a month to deliver educational packages to children based on the latest research in Scandinavia. We live in such a country. This actually happened. I was there. I'm reporting this to you. This is the situation we're in, you see. You may not know in what kind of darkness we live. I need to tell you what the facts are like. This is what the facts are like. You only get newspaper headlines about Trump and Modi, and this is much worse than Trump and Modi. This is our normal people. This is the people we trust. Ordinary intellectuals, and what they think is realistically possible. And they discuss this with serious faces in conferences. So, under these conditions, we have to make progress in order to keep long-term goals in view, in order to keep moving towards them, to improve our capacity, we need to set ourselves short-term targets. Gandhi had this idea of Nai Talim. I call this Narani Talim, Narani being Nai and Purani blended in what we can cope with. Gandhi's Nai Talim was seen as too hard to do. People didn't implement it. Mind you, there were efforts to implement Gandhi's Nai Talim. The Central Provinces government, for example, around 1940-41 was trying to do it. I've read records. My mentor Lakshmishwar Sinha took part in that. So there are stories to tell, but that's a different enterprise. Now the two tiger thing, from old tiger to new tiger. Setting a series of targets will land us, I said, a series of tigers, will land us in an unmanageable mess if we don't come up with a way to handle the big jump from the back of the English tiger to the back of the multilingual tiger. This jump is happening whether we like it or not. It will be completed whether we manage it well or not. Let us try to manage this jump gracefully and with full awareness. As we jump from the back of the old tiger to the new tiger back, we exchange old risks for new. We want to understand the new risks first, postponing for later a full post-mortem of the main difficulties with the English medium tiger that we're still riding. Here we only have the space to summarize rapidly. The main danger of the multilingual education system is the Balkanization. People are afraid Marathi children will grow up knowing only Marathi, Tamilian children only Tamil, etc. Denial or escape is not an option. You need to face up to this danger and handle it intelligently. Notice that they call it Balkanization. Well, let us look at the actual Balkan states in, Southeast Europe to inquire how they have handled their predicament. In this context, we encounter the use of something my introducer was mentioning in connection with my profile, the artificial international language Esperanto as a bridge language. When the state of Croatia has a population of 5 million, sponsors translations of Croatian children's classics into other languages like the Wonderful Adventures of Apprentice Klapić. They pay for people to work through an Esperanto bridge translation into other foreign languages like Bangla, because Croatia cannot expect there to be speakers of Bangla who learn enough Croatian to translate children's literature from Croatian into Bangla. You see, it's not exactly going to happen within anybody's lifetime. When this worked, there were other bigger projects. Slovenia, Croatia, Italy used European Commission funding to get other children's classics from the Balkan region translated into Bangla in the context of cultural exchange. This is a project that was completed in 2010. If even the Balkan states have found these ways to address Balkanization, using translation to surmount these obstacles, we in India, forewarned as we are about what to do if, alas, we fall into the trap of Balkanization, we will know how to avoid the worst rigors of that danger. We too can use the bridge language Esperanto and other bridge languages we already use, drawn from the domain of translation and bridge languages. We have Nagamese, we have Sadari, we have a variety of bridge languages used in different parts of India. When we speak of multilingual, it's not just a matter of the situation we face. We need a multilingual set of solutions for the various problems that we face in different parts of the country, at different age levels of the students, and different kinds of education. The difficulties of scientific technical education, the difficulties of social science education are quite different, for example. Translation is an essential part of the work of fashioning all these solutions. So my next capsule brings translation into the picture at a theoretical and practical level. Even conceptually, independently of the demographic realities of our country, it is not a coincidence that the resources coming to mind should pertain to translation. Translation is the most obvious next-door neighbor of the long-term goal of perspectivism and of the differential imagination that David Blyth exemplifies in his enterprise. As we visualize these short-term interim goals one by one, we'll have to do what I'm calling a triple embedding. The triple embedding goes like this. You embed this differential imagination, the double perspective idea, into translation. You embed translation so enriched into language teaching. You embed language teaching so enriched into the teaching of all subjects. You can't teach subjects without involving language much more essentially than has been happening so far. It is the absence of that embedding that has led to cramming, to sweatshops, to coaching centers, to private coaching, all that. This third step of connecting language teaching and subject teaching properly would involve making the teaching of technical terms individually, one term at a time, and more generally the art of terminology, which is not about this or that technical term, but the entire domain of technical terms. That teaching has to become vivid, it has to become processual. You need a process rather than too much of a focus on the products of each technical term. Connecting this third embedding of embedding language teaching to subject teaching to the first one, embedding the differential imagination into translation, will involve showing your students that you have to constantly translate back and forth between technical language and ordinary language. That itself is an act of translation. And this involves understanding what is involved in technical terminology, and that's a whole separate ball game. My main mentor, Ashok Kelkar, was an expert on what technical terms are, and he built his expertise on the work of Punyashlok Rai, who is a brilliant pioneer that I haven't had time to mention. Trust a Bong to mention another Bong. Punyashlok Rai was only half Bong. His mother was an American. Perspectivism requires bridging distances. In some of our implementations, we will find it appropriate to use the bridge language Esperanto. Not only the Balkan example will lead to this, even in China, some of my Chinese friends have told me, some ELT courses teach some preparatory Esperanto on the way to teaching English. Esperanto helps you get into the horrible spelling system of English because the Esperanto spelling system is rational and user-friendly. It's not just a bridge language helping translators and teachers to deal with the subjects part of the curriculum rather than the languages part. It helps language teachers too, even when the final goal is learning English or some other language. I've got 2 capsules to go. I'll cope within the time thing. Trans-regional pedagogy, a long-term global need. Friends in China tell me that the Chinese authorities, who were teaching so much English because they were competing with India, they are disappointed with the actual results of the massive ELT effort all over China. They plan to do some downscaling. If China really downscales English language teaching from 2020 onwards, which is what they're planning to do, then obviously they won't seriously try to teach everybody Chinese instead, even though they're doing it on a big scale. There are English school children in England at age 5 or 6 who are learning Chinese in a big way. There are big numbers of people learning Chinese. Chinese is the most widely learned foreign language in Dhaka. There's tons of demand for Chinese translators and interpreters. The exit of the ELT enterprise in China will simply call it Chexit, like Brexit if you want, the Chinese exit. It will spell the end of English as a global lingua franca without any replacement. Nobody in China or outside China imagines a world in which Chinese has become the unique global lingua franca, even though Chinese is being learnt on a big scale. It's not just Chinese. You need to know some of the basic facts about language learning. Most people in India don't, because we are this elephant country obsessed with ourselves. If you go to Sri Lanka, you discover, as I did some years ago, that most widely learned foreign language in Sri Lanka, a country where very few people speak English, is German, not English, because 60% of the tourists who come to Sri Lanka and pay big money for the products are from German-speaking countries, Switzerland, Austria, Germany. The result is many Sri Lankan shops have descriptions of their goods in German rather than English. I've been there, I've seen this. All over Colombo you find shops showing wares, advertising their wares in German. German is more widely learnt in Sri Lanka than English, for example. The United States will be less well-placed to propagate English over the next few decades, for the Hispanic population is expanding and speaking much more Spanish than English. By 2050, the Hispanic population, because of Catholicism having different practices, will overtake the Anglophone population of the US. A majority in the US by 2050 will not be English-speaking, but Spanish-speaking. Already in California, a college student in California can't afford to communicate in colleges if they don't at least passively know Spanish. You can't cope in California. There's far too much Spanish on the university campuses. Once the notion of a unique language as a major global verbal currency bites the dust again, which is going to happen in the lifetime of children now in school, the world is going to need a fully elaborated trans-regional pedagogy to be put in place. It is up to us to notice that India, as a nation of nations, it's a trans-nation, is best placed to help everybody. But turning all these points that I've been throwing at you as so many disasters, all these crises, into solutions. This quotation, turning crises into solutions, is from a seminal book by Vygotsky, published 1934, second edition in English 1986. Vygotsky, the giant at the interface of the study of language and that of education, was referring to what he called the crisis in psychology. He was looking at that discipline's inability to converge on a single research paradigm. I'll overshoot by 5 minutes. His approach to psycholinguistics was distinctive, and now that Vygotsky is being discovered by educational theory and practice everywhere, remains distinctive for the following reasons. Praise for Vygotsky. His paradigm places the affective and the cognitive on the same screen. His paradigm frames the scene of instruction, which may be the classroom, it may be whatever setting works, in the parameters of the technological and industrial development of society, especially in its conceptualization of secondary schooling. Much of this is now in terms of computers and cyberspace and websites rather than physically present teachers. His paradigm allows for the heterogeneity and unevenness of social development in what was then the Soviet Union, a multilingual federation, which kept pre-capitalist and even pre-feudal social formations in view. Vygotsky did adventurous things. He did research on children in the Asiatic republics, including illiterate children from vastly different language backgrounds, to see what their cognitive skills are like. It's the equivalent of an Indian Vygotsky performing such experiments on tribal children. Vygotsky's paradigm articulated the pioneering notion of ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development, as a model for teacher-student partnership. I wish I had the time to tell you why ZPD is the most important part of Vygotsky's legacy, but I don't have the time. These features make Vygotsky a vital masala for the rasoi that we need in India. Vygotsky's approach views a student's capacity for learning in terms of its fullest realization that is made possible by an effective teacher stimulating the student. The microsocial place, that's what's called ZPD. The microsocial space that such a teacher creates, and enveloping the teacher-student dyad and giving the student a chance to go beyond her current standalone ability and to approach a full manifestation of her potential, is the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky achieved the vital insight that in order to understand how far a student has been able to travel, the tester or evaluator has to consider not how well the student can perform alone, but what she is able to grasp with the help of the minimal urging that an effective teacher can provide. Even this limited presentation of one aspect of Vygotsky's approach may suffice to show his affinity with Blythe. Unlike many other Soviet thinkers, Vygotsky did not assume that the Soviet Union should keep applying to the Asiatic republics the imperial methods of political and cultural domination that Tsarist Russia had been using. He wanted the children of every school in the Soviet Union to be treated as growing human beings with a right to remain rooted in their own cultural milieu, some of them tribal milieu, if we use the vocabulary that India is still using. Unlike many psychological theorists who likewise believe that the way to achieve a unitary psychological paradigm was for one method to win and clobber all the others in the field and get rid of the others, Vygotsky proposed that psychology's crisis, its multiplicity of theories, should be seen as a solution, that the way to unify the paradigm was to honestly accept its necessary plurality. As you can see, a crisis begins to look like a solution if you change your perspective. As long as some of us are openly predatory and the rest of us directly participate in this rapacity, or like the relatives of the bandit Ratnakara who turned into the sage Valmiki, indirectly benefit from the thefts and robberies and ask no questions provided we keep getting the dividends on our investments, Our attitude will remain controlled by the parameters set by conquest and greed. Once we make the transition to an acceptance of the imperatives of peace and sustainability, it becomes clear that we must all take part in the actions of sustaining for the new paradigm to work. It is in this changed perspective, moving away from greed and conquest, that we begin to understand with Gandhi that the world has enough for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. It is time to conclude. I want to now link to theory, otherwise this isn't really worthy of a seminar of this type. We've chalked out the main points of a serial unpacking of the Blythe-Vygotsky agenda. For those of you who prefer more technical and rigorous exposition, we will say very quickly that the architectural foundation for this cuisine from crisis to solution deploys the paradigmatic axis. The syntagmatic style of linguistic theorizing that has been dominant since the 1950s is associated with ideas of conquest. Bringing material under the umbrella of a single syntagm is an annexational gesture. A balanced biaxial perspective, giving the syntagmatic and the paradigmatic axes equal importance, incubates serious thoughts of durable peace. For one country to learn how to leave other countries alone is to learn how to dream responsibly, not to dream of enlarging your own syntagmatic boundaries, but to dream of harmonizing your existence with the cross-border independence of others without colonizing, without being colonized. This technical point is an unpacking of the struggle against the behaviorist approach to psychology and education. Behaviorism is akin to war. While the generative school that has shaped the most widely known toolkit of contemporary linguistics can be given credit for having pioneered the struggle against behaviorism and for whetting our appetite for better psychological and educational theories, nonetheless a serious overcoming of behaviorism must work with tools that move us towards social peace and personal flourishing. Such an enterprise, vitally needed for India, lies beyond the intellectual, aesthetic and moral horizons within which generative linguistics and its cousins have been working. I say this with immense respect to practitioners of generative linguistics and its cousins, and with immense personal affection for Noam Chomsky. For friends dealing with tribal communities or belonging to tribal communities, those who face the deepest of our crises, there's a bunch of things I say here, but I will omit the paragraph because I must have completely used up all your patience. I'll just read the last line. The last line is, to overcome despair, we have to find ways of turning despair into hope, and to do so without telling pleasant lies. Thank you for your attention.